What if the movies Hollywood pretends never mattered are the ones that shaped everything we watch today? Long before blockbusters played it, safe exploitation films took risks studios were terrified of. Cheap budgets, raw ideas, dangerous themes. These were not accidents, they were test labs. And mainstream cinema quietly borrowed everything. Number 12, Shock Corridor, 1963. Samuel Fuller's Shock Corridor looks like a pulp oddity on the surface. A tabloid journalist fakes insanity to enter a mental institution and solve a murder. But what Fuller smuggles inside that premise is one of the most aggressive political dissections American cinema had attempted up to that point. On racism, nuclear paranoia, Cold War hysteria, and institutional cruelty all collide inside narrow white hallways that feel more like a battlefield than a hospital. This film quietly rewrote how mainstream cinema would later portray psychological breakdown. Instead of treating madness as spectacle, Fuller makes it contagious. The camera moves nervously, the lighting shifts without warning, and characters slide between lucidity and collapse mid-sentence. Decades later, filmmakers like Martin Scorsese and Oliver Stone would echo this approach when portraying unstable protagonists whose environments actively corrode their sanity rather than merely reflect it. What truly influenced Hollywood was Fuller's refusal to separate politics from genre. Shock Corridor proved you could disguise a social indictment as exploitation and still land emotional punches. That idea carried forward into films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and later into prestige thrillers where institutions are the true villains. The asylum here is not a backdrop, it is the antagonist. Mainstream cinema rarely credits this film because it arrived wearing cheap clothes, but its DNA lives on in every psychological drama that uses confined spaces to mirror moral collapse. Fuller showed Hollywood that madness sells best when it feels systemic rather than personal. Number 11, Thriller. A Cruel Picture, 1973. Before stylized revenge became fashionable, Thriller arrived like a bruise. This Swedish exploitation film follows a young woman brutalized by traffickers who trains herself with guns and blades to take revenge. It is cold, methodical, and emotionally distant in ways that made audiences deeply uncomfortable. That discomfort is precisely why it mattered. The film stripped revenge cinema of romanticism. Training is not empowering. It is obsessive, isolating, and destructive. Violence is not cathartic. It is clinical. Quentin Tarantino would later lift this emotional framework wholesale for Kill Bill, replacing grim realism with pop stylization, but keeping the same narrative spine. The solitary warrior, the ritual of preparation, the silence before impact. What Hollywood absorbed was not the surface cruelty, but the structure. Thriller demonstrated that audiences would stay engaged even when the protagonist barely speaks, and emotional expression is muted. Visual storytelling replaces dialogue. Music replaces exposition. This approach later became standard in action cinema, especially in revenge arcs, where motivation is communicated through repetition and ritual rather than speech. Mainstream filmmakers rarely acknowledge this lineage, but the influence is undeniable. From neon-soaked action thrillers to prestige revenge dramas, the bones trace back here. Thriller proved exploitation could be patient, restrained, and psychologically severe. Hollywood learned the lesson quietly and never looked back. Number 10, Ganja and Hess, 1973. Ganja and Hess is often mislabeled as a vampire film. That mistake explains why its influence went unnoticed for decades. Bill Gunn's film uses vampirism as metaphor, not spectacle exploring addiction, spirituality, and identity through fractured editing and poetic repetition. It feels closer to experimental art cinema than grindhouse horror, yet it was released and marketed as exploitation. This collision of expectation and reality shaped a new path for mainstream genre hybrids. Gunn proved horror could carry philosophical weight without abandoning its genre identity. Later, filmmakers would adopt this approach when blending horror with introspection, as seen in films that prioritize mood ambiguity and symbolism over conventional scares. Hollywood absorbed the lesson selectively. You could cloak meditations on race faith and desire inside genre frameworks and reach broader audiences. Jordan Peele's work operates on this same axis decades later, using genre language to interrogate cultural trauma. The roots are here. What makes Ganja and Hess influential is its refusal to explain itself. Meaning emerges through rhythm, sound, and image rather than plot clarity. That approach would later become a staple of elevated genre cinema. Gunn did it first under the banner of exploitation and paid the price in obscurity. Mainstream cinema took the innovation and left the credit behind. Number 9. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, 1970. At first glance, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls looks like a psychedelic joke that got out of hand. Loud colors, fractured editing, sexual excess, and dialogue that feels deliberately artificial. But beneath the chaos lies one of the most important stylistic blueprints modern mainstream cinema ever borrowed. This film did not just mock exploitation, it weaponized it. Written by a mainstream critic and directed by a studio journeyman, this film shattered the invisible wall between trash and satire. It proved that excess could be intentional, that artificiality could be expressive, and that tone could shift violently without losing audience attention. Decades later, this DNA would surface in films that embraced heightened reality rather than naturalism, especially in pop-driven cinema, that treats style as narrative force. The most important influence lies in editing and rhythm. Rapid montage jump cuts and sound-driven transitions replaced classical continuity. Music did not underscore scenes, it attacked them. That approach later became foundational to music video aesthetics, which in turn reshaped Hollywood editing in the 80s and beyond. When mainstream films began cutting to rhythm rather than logic, this film was already there. Hollywood rarely acknowledges Beyond the Valley of the Dolls because it is easier to credit MTV than exploitation cinema. But the bridge was built here. This film proved that audiences could decode irony, excess, and satire simultaneously. Mainstream cinema took the lesson and built entire genres around it. Number 8. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. Few exploitation films carry the stigma of Ilsa She-Wolf of the SS. It was designed to provoke outrage and succeeded spectacularly. Oh, but buried inside its shock tactics is a lesson mainstream cinema quietly absorbed about power dynamics and villain construction. Ilsa is not terrifying because of gore alone. She is terrifying because she is institutional. She represents authority, unchecked ideology, weaponized, and cruelty justified by bureaucracy. Later, mainstream villains would follow this exact template, stripping away mustache, twirling theatrics, and replacing them with calm procedural evil. Think of antagonists who terrify because they believe they are right. The exploitation framework allowed this film to push boundaries Hollywood could not at the time. It explored how systems normalize brutality and how individuals disappear inside uniforms and titles. And that thematic focus later surfaced in prestige war films, political thrillers, and even superhero cinema, where institutions rather than individuals become the true threat. Mainstream cinema adopted the architecture while rejecting the surface. The violence became implied, the sexuality was removed, but the cold administrative villain remained. Ilsa proved that fear intensifies when cruelty is procedural rather than emotional. Hollywood learned the lesson quietly and applied it everywhere. Number 7. Coffee, 1973. Pam Grier's Coffee was sold as sensational revenge exploitation. What it actually delivered was a prototype for the modern action heroine. Before empowerment branding, before studio, approved toughness, Coffee presented a female protagonist who was decisive, aggressive, and morally uncompromising. What influenced mainstream cinema was not just representation, but framing. Coffee is not protected by irony or softened by humor. The camera treats her with the same authority traditionally reserved for male anti-heroes. Violence is direct. Motivation is personal. Consequences are permanent. Later action cinema would borrow this framework repeatedly, often without acknowledging its origin. From blockbuster franchises to prestige thrillers, the lone Avenger model owes a debt here. Coffee demonstrated that audiences would accept women in roles defined by agency rather than victimhood. Hollywood followed years later, but only after exploitation cinema proved the concept without permission. The influence is clearest in character design, confidence through stillness, threat communicated through posture rather than dialogue, and empower established visually rather than narratively. These are now mainstream conventions. They were radical then. Coffee took the risk so Hollywood would not have to. Number 6. Black Christmas, 1974. Long before slashers became a formula, Black Christmas quietly wrote the Rulebook. Released years before Halloween, this Canadian exploitation film introduced techniques mainstream horror would later treat as standard: the killer's point of view, the use of holiday innocence as contrast, the refusal to provide narrative comfort or moral closure. What made Black Christmas influential was its restraint. Violence is suggested rather than displayed, yet the tension is unbearable. The camera lingers where it should not. Sound design becomes psychological weaponry. Breathing whispers, phone calls that feel invasive rather than theatrical. This approach taught Hollywood that fear does not require spectacle. It requires control. The most important lesson lies in ambiguity. The film refuses to explain its killer. There is no backstory, no motivation, no neat resolution. Evil simply exists. That concept would later be central to mainstream horror icons, whose power comes from unknowability rather than explanation. When studios learned that mystery sells better than mythology, this film was already decades old. Black Christmas also redefined the final girl without naming her. The protagonist survives not because she is pure, but because she is observant, resourceful, and willing to act. Yes, this subtle shift influenced how mainstream cinema would later write female survival narratives, especially in horror and thrillers. Exploitation cinema planted the seed. Hollywood monetized it. Number 5. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Few films reshaped mainstream horror as violently as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Made with almost nothing, it felt like documentary footage smuggled into theaters. That realism changed everything. Suddenly, horror did not need monsters or mythology. It needed atmosphere, exhaustion, and dread. What Hollywood absorbed was the aesthetic of decay. Natural light handheld cameras, non-professional performances, and soundscapes built from machinery rather than music. This stripped-down approach later resurfaced in prestige horror and independent cinema, where authenticity became the new currency of fear. The film also introduced moral discomfort as entertainment. There are no heroes here, only survivors. Violence is chaotic, ugly, and unresolved. That tone influenced mainstream thrillers that abandoned clean victories in favor of trauma-driven endings. Audiences learned to accept emotional residue instead of relief. Perhaps most importantly, this film proved that low-budget exploitation could outperform studio horror financially and culturally. Hollywood took notice. Distribution models changed, marketing strategies shifted, and horror became a testing ground for innovation rather than a dumping ground. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was not just a film, it was a business lesson Hollywood never forgot. Number 4. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. George Romero's Night of the Living Dead did not just invent modern zombies, it reinvented independent cinema. Shot outside the studio system with unknown actors and bleak politics,